So we're holding 9b3 all the way on the bottom by the in the art scroll on the bottom of the left hand column, and in the Gemara on the first wide line on the bottom. We were dealing with the machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. In our Mishnah, Beis Shammai said you're allowed to tilt a ladder from one opening of a pigeonhole to another opening of a pigeonhole within one dovecote, but you're not allowed to carry the ladder. Beis Hillel said you're most certainly allowed to carry the ladder, and you can carry it from one dovecote to another. So clearly Beis Hillel was greatly lenient, where Beis Shammai is being, as usual, being stringent, being more chomer. The problem with that is that we have a case, another machlokes, where if you slaughter an undomesticated animal, a chaya, or an oif, or a bird on Yontif, Beis Shammai says it's okay. If you have a shovel, you're allowed to cover it up, the kisei adam, with the din of that you have to cover over the dam. Beis Hillel says absolutely not, unless you have the dirt from the day before, which means that when it came to simchas Yontif, preparing food for Yontif, with regard to kisei adam, Beis Hillel is the stringent one, Beis Shammai is the lenient one, which is just the opposite of their rule with preparing food, getting a pigeon from a dovecote. Beis Shammai is the stringent one, Beis Hillel is the lenient one. So we're going back and forth. And Rabbi Yochanan said so. In that case, the easy answer is muchlepes hashita, switch these shitas. In other words, that in fact it's Beis Hillel that says that you're not allowed to take the ladders from one dovecote to another dovecote, and Beis Shammai is the one that allows it, so that Beis Shammai is consistently the one that's lenient, and Beis Hillel is the one that's consistent, stringent. And our Gemara said that doesn't have to be the case, and we're going backwards and forth. So we're trying to understand. Now we're in our Gemara over here, Elai kasha hakasha. If this is the difficulty that Rabbi Yochanan said, that we've got to switch the shitas that is written down, and in fact flip it and make Beis Shammai the kula and Beis Hillel the chumrah. What's the case? It's what's coming up on the next amud, which we're about to get to. The Mishnah on the next amud. Beis Shammai Yomi, lo yitol ela im kein nana mibayim. You're not allowed to take a dove from the dovecote on Yontif unless you had handled those specific doves on Erev Yontif. If on Erev Yontif you climbed up to the dovecote, you literally picked up the birds and said, these birds are the ones I'm going to use on Yontif, that you're allowed to do. Otherwise, if you didn't do that before Yontif, the birds themselves are muksa and you're not allowed to touch them. Beis Hillel says, you don't have to actually pick up the birds. It's merely enough to say, I will take this dove and that dove verbally without actually handling them. Alma, Galbe Simchas Yontif, regarding the idea of joy of Yontif, meaning having food on Yontif, Beis Shammai l'chumra, Beis Hillel l'kula. Beis Shammai is more chumra. He said it's not enough to make a verbal declaration. I've got to actually pick them up on Erev Yontif. Beis Hillel says it's enough a verbal declaration. Veramino, but that's a stira, because you see how Shaychit Chayav Yontif. If you slaughter a chay or a knife on Yontif, and you have to cover over the blood, and Beis Shammai says you can go dig into the ground and cover it up. And Beis Hillel comes along and says that you're not allowed to. So I've got in one case, Beis Hillel is the kula, in another case, Beis Hillel is the chumrah. Rabbi Yochanan over here in this case, Muchlach Lashita, that Rabbi Yochanan is saying, go ahead and change the order. We've got it wrong. Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, you got to flip it. So in other words, it's Beis Shammai who maintains that in fact the oral designation is good enough, and it's Beis Hillel that says you actually have to go and physically handle the birds. Says the Gemara, no, that doesn't make, no, maybe not. This can, I could say, Ad kan like Amar Rabbi Shammai. that Beis Shammai did not say that you could. That Beis Shammai said that you're allowed to take the earth out of the ground on Yom Kippur on Yom Tov in order to cover up the blood. No, that's only where the spade, the shovel was already in the ground. So from the day before, you had already loosened up the ground. So therefore, since you loosened it up, there is no prohibition anymore going on. You're merely lifting up dirt that was already displaced before Yom Tov. So there's no prohibition. That's where Beis Shammai says it's okay to cover over the Kisei Adam. And now we're on today's daf. Yud Amud Aleph 10a1. But where there is no spade already inserted into the ground, where there is no shovel in the ground, even Beis Shammai would agree with Beis Hillel that you cannot go ahead and dig into the ground because that's charisha. It sure looks like plowing. So now that's consistent with the position that in the case of designating doves, there is a takanas rabbanon, a rabbinic prohibition that is not waived for the sake of the yontif. Just like over there by Kisei Adam, if you did not have the shovel in there from the day before from Erev Yontif and having loosened up the earth already, you cannot do it lichatchila on Yontif itself. I won't have food for my table. Tough noogies. You should have done it before. You should have done it before on Erev Yontif. Same thing with the birds. You should have gone ahead and handled the birds and lifted it up and said, these birds specific are the birds that I'm going to use on Yom Tov. Inami, you can look at it from Beis Hillel's way. With regard to Beis Hillel, where he ruled leniently, that you don't have to actually handle the birds, it's enough to have a verbal declaration. Because we're only dealing with muksa. By standing and saying, I will take this bird and I will take this bird, specifically you say which bird you're going to take by a verbal declaration, it's enough to lift the muksa problem. But in the case of the shovel, that's not good enough. There's a rabbinical decree applicable even according to Beis Hillel, and he says, what are you talking about? Displacing earth looks too much like charisha. That's problematic. So therefore, this is not the place where Rabbi Yochanan seems to be saying that you should switch the shittas, that we have it wrong, and Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel's opinions need to be flipped. Where there's a Jerry, this makes sense so far. Just want to make sure, Jerry, it makes sense, right? You understand?
Yes.
Because it's going to go this way all the way to the Mishnah. Great. If this is then the case, this is where Rabbi Yochanan is saying we've got to split their opinions. Beis Shammai Yoimrim, it's a Mishnah now coming up tomorrow's daf on Daf Yud Aleph. The Mishnah says, Ein Beis Shammai Yoimrim. Beis Shammai says, Ein noitlaneso ali lakatze v'lo basa. You're not allowed to take a pestle on Yontif to chop meat upon it. Ubeis Hillel matirin. Beis Hillel is matir. Now, what is a pestle used for? In those days, this is the reason why medicine was not allowed on Yom Tov. It's not that medicine is not allowed on Shabbos and Yom Tov, but they used to have to grind the ingredients together to make the medicine. They would grind it in a special pestle, it was called, a deep utensil. And they would take the thing and they would pound down on it and grind. Grinding is one of the Lamites Malachas. So it's also on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. So now, here I'm only chopping meat, which I'm allowed to. Nonetheless, comes Beis Shammai, and he says, because this keli is used normally to grind, right? I'm not allowing you to chop meat on it on Yom Tov. Beis Hillel matirin, and Beis Hillel says you are allowed to. Alma, gabe simchas Yom Tov. You see, with regard to the joy of Yom Tov, the ability to eat on Yom Tov, Beis Shammai lechumra, Beis Hillel lekula. Beis Shammai is stringent, Beis Hillel is lenient. Veriminu from our Mishnah, Hashem Chai Boys, Beis Shammai, when you slaughter a wild animal or a fowl on Yom Tov. Beis Shammai says you're allowed to take the dirt from the ground. Beis Hillel says you're not allowed to take the dirt from the ground. So over there, Beis Hillel is being the Chumrah, and Beis Shammai is being the Kula. So it looks like it's a flip. So Rabbi Yochanan Muchlef Hashita switch the Shita. In other words, Beis Shammai would answer the use of the pestle, and Beis Hillel would in fact rule. I mean, Beis Shammai would permit use of the pestle, and Beis Hillel would in fact rule it's forbidden to use the pestle. Okay, so says the Gemara, Mimai, who said that that's what it's got to be? No, Dilmalohi, I can explain it all. Beis Shammai didn't say over there that you're allowed to remove the earth. No, it's only where the shovel was already in the earth from Erev Yontif, and so the earth was already turned over. So it doesn't look like harisha, it doesn't look like plowing. You're merely taking loose earth and covering up the blood. But where there is no spade inserted into the ground, so the ground is hard, you cannot on Yontif stick a spade in order to bring up earth to cover up the blood. So you see that, in fact, that there is, in such a case, Beis Shammai would be Chumrah as well. So I'm thinking over here, with regard to the pestle, Beis Shammai would say the same thing, since the pestle, its actual use, it's a keli shemalachto le'isser, it's a utensil whose actual function is a forbidden function. Keli shemalachto le'isser, a pestle is made to make the grind ingredients together to make medicine, which is an Issa right? So the grinding. So too, you cannot use it on a rabbinical level to chop the meat. So therefore, he's consistent, a chumrah to a chumrah, because he's only making where the shovel was in from Erev Yontif. But if you first stick the shovel in on Yontif, no good. Inami, ad kan like come Beis Hillel haka. Over here, Beis Hillel ruled leniently that you could use the pestle, ela the ikatayris ki keli alav, because the pestle is a metaltalin, is a movable utensil, and a movable utensil is not considered muksa according to Beis Hillel's opinion. He says even though it's a keli shemalachta le'iser, even though it's a utensil that its normal use is for forbidden purposes, for grinding, nonetheless, because it's movable, it can go ahead and shift to a malachta leheter. It can be used for a function that is mutter, because he holds like Rab Shimon and has a very narrow view of muksa, not like Rabbi Yehuda, that is a very expansive. Elo, because Keli Alav, Aval Hasam Lai, with regard to digging up the earth, there's an absolute rabbinical decree according to Beis Hillel, and they don't waive it. So everything works out. So in that case, we don't have to change their shitas. We don't have to change their opinions. So what's the case of Rabbi Yochanan Mechulefes Hashita? Switch the opinions of Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. Ela ikasha. If there's a difficulty, this is the difficulty. And again, the Mishnah that's coming up tomorrow, it continues. You're not allowed to place hide. That means the skin of an animal. You what do you call it, as a tannery, where it will be trampled upon. Tannery, in other words, the malacha of ma'abed, tanning, is one of the lamites malachas. Trampling on the hide until it gets hard is part of the avodah, the part of the work of ma'abed. It's clearly also on Shabbos and Yom Tov. But what he's saying over here is, if I have a hide and I'm simply laying it out almost like a carpet, says Beis Shammai, I'm not allowed to place the hide where it will be trampled upon. You're not even allowed to pick up the hide unless attached to it is a kizayis, an olive volume of meat on it. If there's an olive volume of meat on it, then obviously the meat I'm allowed to have for Yom Tov, then I'm allowed to move it. Ubeisilu matirin. My Beisilu says it's completely good, right? It's completely good. That's what he called, because if one were not allowed to move the hide and put it where it might be trampled, he might refrain from slaughtering the animal completely on Yom Tov, in which case he won't have any food on Yom Tov, which in that case would mean that he won't have any simchas Yom Tov. So Beisilu is materit. Alma, we see God Simchas Yom Tov, Beishamai L'chumra, Beisilu L'kula. Beishamai is L'chumra, and Beisilu is L'kula V'Reminu. That's just the opposite. Asher Chai V'Oif Yom Tov. In the case of Asher Chai V'Oif Yom Tov, Beishamai is the one who allows us to bring up dirt and cover up the blood on Yom Tov. Beisilu says you're not allowed to. So Rabbi Yochanan Muchlefes Hashita. So now switch the shita that in fact it's Beis Shammai that allows the placement of the hide, and Beis Hillel is the one that answers that does not allow the placement of the hide. We're now on 10.8.2. So on this, says the Gemara, nope, this can't either be the case of Rabbi Yochanan, where he says Muchlefes Hashitas turn the opinions around. Why? Because I can touch it up like this. Mimai, Dil Maloyi. Maybe it's not a problem. There, Beis Shammai didn't say that you're allowed to take the earth from the ground. It's where the shovel was in from Erev Yom Tov, and the earth was already loosened up. So it's not a problem of charisha, of plowing. And so all I'm doing is taking loose earth and picking it up and covering up the blood. Now it's like there's no spade into the ground. Beis Shammai would absolutely agree with Beis Hillel that you cannot bring up the dirt and cover it up. So you see, he agrees with the stringency. So therefore, the same thing with the hide, he says is a rabbinical decree, a takanas rabbanon, a gezeris rabbanon, that do not place the hide where it can be trampled, even though, and do not pick up the hide unless it has a kazayas of meat on it, because what he calls, otherwise it looks too close to tanning. Inami. Beis Hillel didn't rule leniently over here about spreading out the hide, because at the very least the hide is fit to sit on. So once again, it has a meleches heter. It has a function for permitted use. A function for permitted use. It's perfectly fine for me to sit on it. Over there, the very digging, yes, covering up the blood is allowed. But till you get to covering up the blood, first you have to dig up the dirt. To dig up the dirt itself has no meleches heter. It absolutely has no meleches heter. It has no permitted function. So therefore, in and of itself, it has no permitted function. So therefore, even Beis Hillel would agree you cannot do it. So kasha. So Elamai, I've got one more shot at showing where Rabbi Yochanan's idea of switching the opinions comes up. Once again, the Mishnah again on tomorrow Amid Beis on 11b will teach as follows. Beis Shammai Oimrim ein misalkin es teresin biyontiv. You're not allowed to remove window shutters for use as vendor trays on Yom Tov. In the ancient times, you had the shopkeepers had windows. They would cover up the windows with a wooden shutter. They would fit the wooden shutter into the space of the window. Then they would come back by day and they would remove the wooden shutter completely, right, and lay it flat and use it as a tray to display their wares. Okay? So we're saying over here now, with regard to Yom Tov, Ein misal says Beis Shammai Yomin, Ein misalkin is a teresin b'Yom Tov. One cannot remove the window shutters for use on Yom Tov, even though you want to use it, let's say, to bring in the meat. You want to use it as a food tray now to bring in the food on Yom Tov from the kitchen to the table. You're not allowed to. Beis Hillel matirin afla hachzir. But Beis Hillel says not only are you allowed to remove it, the shutter and use it as a tray, but you're even allowed to put it back into the window. What do you call it after its use? Alma, what do you see? Gabi Simchas Yontif, Beishamai Lechumra, Beisil Lekula. That Beishamai is clearly strict, and Beisil is a Kula. Veriminu from Agamara, Hashaychit Chayiv Yontif. If one slaughters the wild animal or fowl on Yontif, Beishamai says, I'm allowed to dig up the dirt and to cover up the blood. Beisil does not. So Beisil is the Chumra, Beishamai is the Kula. So now, we don't even say so. Over here, Beishamai, Rabbi Yochanan, it says, switch the Shitas. First, the Gemara immediately jumps in. It's not a problem. The case of digging up the dirt is when on Arab Yontif he already stuck the shovel into the ground and loosened up the dirt, so there's no problem of charisha plowing. But here in the case of the window shutters, there's no spade inserted into the ground. There's no basis for the leniency. In other words, it's already in the window. It's a shutter. It's a melecha sa'issa because it's used for mekach or memka. It's used for business, right? It's used for business normally. So its function is forbidden on Yom Tov and certainly Shabbos. Its function is aser. So I have no leniency. Ela beisila kasha. But beisila is definitely a problem. How could Beitzah by the dirt be chamor over here, be so makel, by the window shutter be makel? So Amar Rabbi Yochanan muchlach v'shita, reverse the shita, right? Okay, so there's a machlokes that one says, Rashi seems to say Beishamai is the one that allows the removal of the shutter and the replacement of the shutter, and it's Beitzah that will have to be prohibited. Tosfos goes the other way and says that in fact it's the dirt, it's the digging of the earth that would be flipped. Beishamai would say you're not allowed to dig up the earth, and Beisil said you are allowed to dig up the earth. But says the Gemara, Inami, no, I can resolve the problem too. Kind of like Beisil Hacha. Beisil didn't rule leniently over here in the case of the window shutters, Elamishum de Ein Binyan Bekalim, because there's no such thing as construction with regard to metaltalin, movable utensils. Since it's immovable, it's always removable. The shutter is made to be removed. So it's not considered part and parcel of the building. So this that you're fitting it into the window is only a temporary thing, almost like what you do when the hurricane is coming. You temporarily built something over there, but it's not considered part of the building. And the rule is, stirot bekalin, nor does the labor of demolishing for a good purpose. You're not allowed to demolish something for a good purpose. In other words, you demolish in order to build. You're not allowed to do. It's not considered in the case of movable objects, metaltalin, kela metaltalin. There's no such prohibition. So there's no prohibition over there. So Beitzah says there's no room for any kind of rabbinical decree. So of course you're allowed to take it out and you're allowed to put it back. It's not a problem. Elahasam, in the case of digging up dirt, where clearly, yes, the dirt is needed for kisei adam. I'm allowed to kisei adam. But while I'm digging the dirt, that's before I'm covering the blood. The digging up the dirt itself is a problem of charisha. It looks too close to charisha, it looks too close to plowing. Says Beitzah, I'm not allowed to do it over there. So we're now up to 10A3. It turns out that we don't have a clarity in reality of where Rabbi Yochanan came up with the idea of Muchulefes Hashita. The truth is, I can even come up with always another way to explain that you don't have to flip the opinions. Okay, and the Gemara leaves it over there. Now, we're back to the birds with what we just talked about this Mishnah before. Beishamai says, Lo yito, you are not allowed to take a dove from the dove coat on Yontif, unless you actually handled that bird, you picked it up and said, this is the bird I'm going to take on Yontif to put on my table, right? you have to do that Erev Yontif. Beis Hillel Aymid v'Aymer. It's enough if you stand and say Zeh v'Zeh, this one and this one. Ani noitel, I will take without a verbal declaration of specifics to specifically point out which birds you're going to use is allowed without actually having to go ahead and handle the birds. Amar Rav Chana bar Ami says the Gemara Machloikes b'bericha rishayna. The dispute is only on the first brood of the season. Take a look at Rashi, the first Rashi in the Gemara. Rashi says, Bericha Rishayna, Derech Migdule Yoinim. It was the way of those who bring up birds, who bring up doves. La'niach Bericha Rishayna, to leave over the first brood, Shall Kol Shana, from every year, Liyos Sabas La'ama, to be a nachas for the mother. In other words, so that the mother bird will feel happy that her brood is around her, even though you're going to keep on taking all the rest of her broods. Every month she gives birth to another bunch of birds. Nonetheless, the first month you leave the birds. So those birds are not set aside to be eaten. They're not automatically set aside to be eaten. The first brood of the year is set aside to be left with the mother, to keep the mother content so that she'll keep on having babies. Says the Gemara, in that case, the Beis Shammai Sabri Gezinin Dilma Osi Lema'aluche. We decree that the doves must be handled before Yontif, because if one was merely to make an oral declaration, he might come to change his mind and decide to spear them when he takes it in his hands on Yontif. He might have Rachmanis, and he might lift it up and say, these birds, the mother really needs it. It's better for the mother if we leave the birds. And in that case, that will create a muksa problem. Beis Hillel Sabri, Beis Hillel holds, Loi Gazin, we don't make such a decree. In other words, Beis Hillel says it's enough if I make an oral declaration, that's enough. But we're dealing with the second or further on brood. In the opinions of both Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, if you say I will take this one and that one, it's sufficient enough to remove the muksa. Now, the Gemara goes out and takes a look. Beis Hillel, why do you have to be so specific and say this dove and that dove I'm going to take tomorrow on Yontif? Lema, let him just simply say, from this dove coat, I'm going to take some birds without having to specify any of the particular birds. If you're going to say because Beis Hillel, less lay Bereira, Beis Hillel does not accept the principle of Bereira. Remember, what's Bereira? Bereira says that if I have an uncertainty what a person is thinking, his future action will be huvra dovra lemafreya. What he does later will explain that retroactively this is what he had in mind at the beginning. So logically you would say over here, maybe the reason why you have to specify which bird, according to Beis Hillel, is because he doesn't hold from Bereira that what I'm going to do tomorrow, the bird that I'm going to take tomorrow, will retroactively make clear what I had in mind today, Erev Yontif. But if you don't hold from Bereira, you say Ein Bereira, there's no such thing as Chuvra Double of Mafrei, that what I do today will retroactively explain what I did what I meant to do yesterday. Then it turns out that what I did today, what the bird that I picked today, in no way says this is what I had in mind yesterday, which would then mean that this bird is not prepared from the day before, and then it's a din of muksa. Says the Gemara, that can't be, because in fact, Beis Hillel clearly holds from Yesh Bereira, Huvra Double Mafrei, that what I do today retroactively explains what was in my mind yesterday. But Tanya, we learned that Beis Hillel clearly accepts the principle of Bereira. Hameis bebayis, if there's a corpse in a house, v'loy psochim harba, and there are many doorways, and the doorways are behind. In other words, it's a very strange thing. You have an inner room, you then have one door to go out, you have a door out, and then surrounding the outside of the house, which you can't quite see in that room, is a bunch of doors. Okay? And it's not been decided through which door the corpse is going to be removed. Okay? Now, the doors are closed. Even if the doors are closed, so that where the utensils are in the doorway, so the doors are closed. Let's look at them as sliding doors almost. So they're in the doorways are utensils. We say kulam tameim. All the doorways and all the utensils that are in the doorways are tamei. Because since I don't know from which door the corpse is going to pass through, we say all of them are tamei. Niftach echad mehem. But if one of the doors is then open, you slide open one of the doors. So now we have an assumption that the mace will pass through that door. Now things change. Who tamei? Then that door remains tamei. The kulon ta'irim, and all the other doors now become tar, and the keilim become tar. From here, it seems to be saying that the keilim that are inside, the utensils that are inside the doorway, retroactively lose their tamei status and now become tahar, pure, from day one, from the beginning, all the way, not mikan la'abad, not moving forward, but all the way retroactive. If the doors were closed and the person responsible for removing the mace decides to remove it through one of the doors, or through a window that's at least 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim, the minimum size to take out a mace, even before he actually opens that door that he chose, it saves all the other doorways from the status of Tumah, because it's assumed that the corpse is going out through that opening. That's only if he decided that on that specific doorway, only before the person died. Even if he makes a decision in his mind after the person died, that doorway is tamei. All the other doorways remain tahar. In other words, this seems to be an argument of berera. Look inside the article on top and turn on to 10a4. Beis Shammai does not accept the principle of berera. Therefore, they state that the decision to remove the corpse through a particular door must be made before death, for otherwise the utensils in all the doors become tamei at the moment of death and remain in that state even when the decision is eventually made. Beis Hillel, on the other hand, accepts berera. Hence, in their view, even if the decision about a particular door is made after the death of the person, the kalim, the utensils, and all the other doorways then become tar retroactively. They say that huvra davar lemafreya, by me choosing this door, it means all the other doors, by definition, retroactive were never tamei, but were in fact tar, and their utensils are tar. So you see that Beis Hillel holds from berera. Says the Gemara, no. In fact, Beis Hillel is not talking about retroactiveness. He's only talking about the doorway should become tar from now on. In other words, moving forward, only kalim that you put in there after I made the choice, those kalim are tar. But the kalim that were there before you made the choice remain tamei. They remain tamei. V'chein amar Rabbi Ishia, and so says Rabbi Ishia, l'taris hapsach mikan la'aba. According to it only means to mimitar the doorways only from now on. Mikan la'aba in lemafreya loy, but not going backwards. So according to this explanation, Beis Hillel does not accept berera. So therefore, that's why they need by our birds to say Zev is there. This and this specifically are the birds I'm going to take, as opposed to being more broad and simply saying, from this stovecoat, I'm going to take birds. But the Gemara says, maybe not. In fact, Basil holds from Pereira, and that retroactively, the doorways are all tar, except for the one which you chose to bring the mace out of. And the reason why Basil says that you have to be specific in which bird you're going to take. If he does not decide before Yontif which bird specifically to take, and he merely says, from this dove coat I will take, then when it comes to Yontif, he might pick up one dove, peel it, and say, this is not fat enough, put it down. Pick up another bird, say it's still not fat enough, until he chooses, which means we come at Tal to Midi the Loichazi, and then he's therefore moving a dove that's unsuitable to him. So in fact, it turns out he's touching Muksa, he's moving Muksa. Says the Gemara, but that you can't explain it that way. But you can see that when Rasul says, I'm saying, I will take this stove and this stove, it's sufficient without handling them. If he didn't handle them, we should worry that regardless on Yom Tov, when he does handle those birds that he specifically chose, he'll discover they're very skinny birds and switch them for different birds. So you're going to run into the same problem of muksa. Says the Gemara, Hani mili me'erev Yom Tov. These words of Basil, that I will take this one and that one, are good because they're taking place on Erev Yom Tov. And as Rashi on the bottom of the page explains, by the very fact that this guy is going on Erev Yom Tov to designate the birds, means he knows the halachas of muksa. His very action of going Erev Yom Tov to designate makes it clear that he knows the rules of muksa. So he knows by saying, I'm going to take this and this bird on Yom Tov, he knows that he dafka has to take these birds on Yom Tov, and he's not allowed to take the other birds, because lifting up other birds is muksa. The very fact that he does the declaration on Erev Yom Tov, he goes out of his way to do the declaration, that explains that he knows the halachas. Very good. We're on Amud Beis. We are now on 10b1. We're just going to keep going till 9 o'clock. Here we go. Abel b'yontav aser. Right, but on Yontav itself, if he makes the actual choice on Yontav, he says, from here I will take, it's aser. He will find birds that look fat but feel thin, but are actually lean. Uchushim shemeinim, or lean that are actually fat. And he will be moving birds that he doesn't need, and they will be muksa. That's why Basil says, if the guy goes and makes a declaration on Erev Yom Tov, that declaration works for those specific birds. But if he didn't make a declaration on Yom Tov, then you got a problem. He comes on Yom Tov to take birds, that he's not allowed to do. Inami zimne mishkach dechula kichushin. Or if he doesn't make a selection before Yom Tov, he does not select before Yom Tov specifically this bird and this bird, it will transpire that when he's going up to take doves on Yom Tov, they'll all be lean. And he'll leave them. And he'll therefore refrain from having any meat on Yom Tov. And if that's the case, he's missing out on Simchas Yom Tov. So this Basil is not going to allow. Now we go to the next Mishnah. What
did we resolve here? I'm just trying to understand.
Okay, what we're resolving.
What is the psak at the end?
Okay, so the psak is this. The truth is, why do I have to declare anything before Erev Yom Tov? I don't. I'm allowed to have meat on Yom Tov. So why do I have to declare? So that's what the Gemara is coming to explain. Beis Shammai says the reason why you have not only declare, but actually have to lift up the birds, because while you're allowed to take one bird on Yom Tov for your Yom Tov table, right? You're allowed to have meat on your Yom Tov, because you might end up handling a whole bunch of birds. The birds you don't take, by definition, are muksa. And if they're muksa, they're asa to you. Beitzah says, listen, it's enough to make a verbal, okay? But the question is, if you're enough to, why do I have to make even a verbal? The answer is, Beitzah is saying, by making a verbal, you're saying, I know the halachis of muksa. That's enough on Erev Yontif. But then you have to take the specific bird. But on Yontif itself, where in reality I should be allowed to take a bird on Yontif, because I need it for my table to have meat on my table. Nonetheless, you might come to lift up other birds according to Beitzah, because you're going to think this bird is fat, and then you're going to realize it's only ear and it's actually skinny. And the skinnier bird might be the more one with more fat on it. So you'll end up touching too many birds, or you'll discover they're all lean and decide not to take any meat. So, and we want you to take meat on Yontif. So that's really what's going on here. Because the underlying thing is that none of it should be needed, because you should be allowed to touch whatever you want in order to go ahead and take meat. But the answer is no, you can't. You can't, because by definition, whichever one birds you touched and didn't take are by definition muksa, and that's your isser. So how do I get around that problem? That's what we're playing with. And look how we go with the next Mishnah. It even gets worse. If he designated black doves before Yontif, and on Yontif found only white ones, or just the opposite, found designated white and found blacks. He designated 2 birds, and on Yontif he found 3, and he's unable to figure out which 2 he designated. In all these cases, Isurim, all the birds he finds are prohibited, as we're going to find, because the assumption is going to be these weren't the birds that you designated. Shloisha, if he designated 3 birds, umatza shnayim, and only finds 2 actually on Yontiv, mutar, and it's muta, because we're going to say one of the birds hopped away or flew away. B'toich hakan, inside the pigeonhole, umatza lifnei kanesurin. He designated those from one pigeonhole, and then on Yontif he found them on the ledge outside the pigeonhole. They're aser, according to Beis Shammai. The im ain't sham elaheim, but if there's only these birds in the vicinity of the dovecote, hare elu mutarin, then they were a mutar, because we make an assumption. It just means the birds came out onto the ledge, and it's the same birds. Says the Gemara Pshita. Wait a minute, this is obvious. If I designate black and they're only white, and they're only black, I don't need you to teach me that it's prohibited. The actual cases where he designated black doves and white doves, each color code, each bird, each color group in its own pigeonhole. And then in the morning he finds the black doves in the pigeonhole of the white holes, of the white ones. He finds the white doves in the place of the black ones. You might say that they're really the same birds and they merely change their place. Kamash Malan, that no. We can assume that these other birds went away, and the birds that are currently in the dovecotes are new ones. Say this is going according to Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Chanina, Roiv says if most of the butcher shops in a town are kosher, and you find a piece of meat outside the butcher shops, the majority say that the meat came from a kosher shop and you're allowed to use the meat. Karaib would be in the base of Migdash. If you remember, there are 13 pushkas, 13 boxes in which the shkalim are put into. If you find a coin outside one of the boxes, we put the coin back into the box that's karaib, that's close by. So in our case, the majority of birds in the world are outside the dovecote. So therefore, the majority comes from outside. The birds that are near the vicinity are the birds that I picked yesterday. Nonetheless, according to Rav Chanina, we choose the Rive over the Karive. The Rive and birds are from the outside, and therefore I got to make an assumption these birds are not the birds I chose. Says the Gemara, no. Ryan says no. Bidaf, we're dealing with a dove coat with a platform in front of it. And we're now on 10b2. 10b2. And a platform in front of it. Other birds from the neighborhood come to roost on that platform. Hachanami bidaf. Over here, we're dealing with a platform also on it. So it's possible that the birds that are on that platform are other birds that came to roost. But it's no raya to Rab Chanina that over here we go with roiv and not karoiv. We have no proof of that. Further, shnayim u'matzah shalosh asurim. Two birds and you find three, they're also. Manashach, the bird, the Gemara explains. If these are different birds from the one he designated, then of course it's also because they're different birds. Even if two of the birds are not different, two of the birds are the one that he chose, there's one bird that's mixed up in it. And since it's unknown which of the birds are designated, which of the birds are muksa, and which bird is muksa, they're all forbidden. They're all forbidden. And we don't say roiv. We don't say roiv over here. And that the bird I'm going to take most likely is from the two birds that I did choose, because kol kavua kemechza mechza davi. Right? We always say that anything that's separated, right? Anything that's kavua, anything that's in its place, right? That's, remember with the case of the 9 stores. If you're in the store, you didn't find the piece of meat outside the store. You found a piece of meat in your bag, and you're not sure which store you came out of. We said you have an equal probability of coming out of each store. It's not loose, the meat, it's in your bag. Now it's totally in you in the gadro. Same thing over here. The birds are in the dove coat. They're kodveya in the dove coat. So each one is mutually exclusive. So each bird has to be looked at individually. So there's no right. Okay, so now, says the Gemara, Shleish, and this is going to be the last piece that we're going to get into today. Okay, says the Gemara, 3, but you find 2, they're allowed. My tama, hani inuninu. These are the same 2 of the original 3 that we chose. The chayminayu azalama. One of them moved away. One of them flew off. Says the Gemara, should we say therefore our Mishnah is the sheet of Rebbe and not the Rabbana? The Tanya we learned in a Beitzah, hanicha mana. If one put a mana, a Maisa Sheni in a box, Umatza Masayim, and later found 2 mana, double in the box, and can't recall whether he put a second mana in there. And Chulin Umaisa Sheni Murufim Zebazeh. We look at it as if the ordinary non-Maisa Sheni coin and the Maisa Sheni coin got mixed up with each other. Divrei Rebbe, and what do? You make it tonight. And you say, if this coin that I'm taking out is Chulin, the other one is Maisa Sheni. And if the coin that I'm taking out is Maisa Sheni, then what I'm doing is transferring its Kedusha, its holiness, its sanctity onto the other coin. Either way, you can take one coin out. Divrei Rebbe. No, we make an assumption that all the money in the box is ordinary money, because people do not mix their Maisa Sheni money, their tzedakah money, with their regular money. They have a different bank account for their tzedakah money. That's if one placed 2 manas of Maisa Sheni in a box. Umatza mana and found only 1 coin in the box. Manach menuach and mana muto. It's assumed that a mana of the original 2 still remains in the box, and the other mana was removed. Divrei Rebbe. They're all ordinary, because again you do not mix. Our Mishnah, which rule when the number of doves in the dove coat is found to have decreased, the remaining birds are assumed to be from the original group. Therefore, must accord with Rebbe, who gives the same opinion with regard to the decrease in coins. Not like the Rabbanon, says the Gemara, afilu tema Rabbanon. No, it can even be like the Rabbanon. This is what we're saying. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar, Damet Havayu, Rabbi Elazar, let's explain our Mishnah like as follows. Shani Goizos Hoilbe sooner than Dados. Young birds are different than coins because young birds tend to hop about. They disappear. So it would not be unusual for one bird to have hopped out, leaving over the other two. But a coin does not hop out on its own. It has to be deliberately removed. We're now on 10b3. 10b3. So therefore, when removed, and Ma'aser Sheni coins, when removed, are removed together. So our Mishnah is not a contradiction to the Rabbanon. Says the Gemara, Allah. Why is it necessary to explain our Mishnah? Shani that the young birds hop out, but we can learn the following with regard to the machlokes between Rebbe and the Rabbanon. The Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar. The Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar explained the machlokes. Chadam one said b'shnei kisim machlokes. We're dealing only in the case of two purses, one with the money of Ma'aser Sheni and one with the chulin money in the other. But when the money is a Ma'aser, I'm sorry, not chulin. When the one mana of Ma'aser Sheni was in one wallet, and the mana of another Ma'aser Sheni was in a separate wallet. But was in one wallet. Everybody says it's really ordinary money because he would not have taken out one coin of Ma'aser Sheni and leave over another coin. He would have taken out both coins together. The Chadam, just the opposite. In the case of one wallet, that's where they're arguing. That one was taken and one was removed. In other words, even the Rabbanan would agree that the other coin is Ma'aser Sheni. Now, according to the one who says that they're arguing by two purses, that's why you need to answer over here. Shani guys, let's over through the dados. Young birds are different. Is how much they hop about. But in the case of the dispute where one purse, that the second coin is definitely Ma'aser Sheni, then why do I have to answer in our mission that young birds are different, they hop out? Everybody says the Rebbe's and the Rabbanan do not argue that by two, that one of them is definitely Ma'aser Sheni. It definitely remains Ma'aser Sheni because each coin is looked at mutually exclusive Ma'aser Sheni. So the same applies over here. Although one bird left, the others remain behind. So you don't need to say that it hops about. Amar Rebbe Ashi. We're dealing in a case of young birds that are tied together, and in the case of wallets that are tied together. Since birds hop around, they're going to pull it apart. They're going to pull the string apart. And obviously, wallets which are inanimate do not pull themselves apart. So only in the case of tied purses do the Rabbanan agreed that if one mana was removed, so was the other. In the case of birds tied together, they concede that one of the birds may have left the dovecote by itself. The Rebbe Amalach, Kisinamizim, even in the cases that purses are tied together, sometime we're now on 11a1, and this is where we're ending, the mistakil katrayu, that sometimes their knots become untied. So even there, it's possible for one mana to be taken and one mana to be left over. And here we end. So it turns out, before we end the thing, that we don't think this way, though, Jerry, you might, actually, because you're in the food business. Dove coats were a big, big deal in the time of the Gemara. Birds were cheap meat. They were cheaper than animals. In the time of the Beis Hamikdash, you were allowed to bring bird offerings in the Beis Hamikdash. Birds were easy to put food on your table. Doves were easy to catch, so you created dove coats. So therefore, this was big business, and not even so much big business, but everybody had a chicken coop, as it were, in their backyard, just like in the Altaheim. You raise chickens for eggs and ultimately to have food on your table. We don't think this way today because we're so ingrained about put it this way. When my mother was going to Beis Yaakov, they still were taught how to clean a chicken. They were expected to know how to get a whole chicken and clean the chicken. Today, nobody learns those halachas because the Jerry Abramsons of the world are taking care of it.
Yeah.
And that
Forget
means
about
there's a whole section. The kids today don't realize yesterday, 50 years ago. Rabbis don't. That means smicha today is completely different than the smicha of 50 years ago.
Correct.
So that's what you have to learn this Gemara this way. Because you have to understand that the world we're living in today, just yesterday, right before the World War II and right after World War II, that means in the days of our parents and even in the early days of us, these halachas still had validity. Today we look at it and say it's archaic, but in truth, it wasn't archaic for most of our history. Very good. So let's make up, Jerry, where we're learning Shabbos. Obviously, Yud Aleph is Shabbos Daf. So let's see if there's a Mishnah somewhere on Yud Beis. Yeah, the Mishnah on the top of Yud Beis on 12a1. That's where we'll start on Sunday.